We currently estimate that 12-month PCE inflation through October ran at 6.0%. While the October inflation data received so far showed a welcome surprise to the downside, these are a single month's data, which followed upside surprises over the previous 2 months. As Figure 1 makes clear, down months in the data have often been followed by renewed increases. It will take substantially more evidence to give comfort that inflation is actually declining, and by any standard, inflation remains far too high. For purposes of this discussion, I'll focus my comments on core PCE inflation, which omits the food and energy inflation components, which have been lower recently but can be quite volatile. Our inflation goal is for total inflation, of course, as food and energy prices matter a great deal for household budgets. But core inflation often gives a more accurate indicator of where overall inflation is heading. 12-month core PCE inflation stands at 5.0% in our October estimate, approximately where it stood last December when policy tightening was in its early stages. Over 2022, core inflation rose a few tenths above 5%, and it fell a few tenths below, but mainly it moved sideways. So when will inflation come down? I could answer this question by pointing to the inflation forecasts of private forecasters or of FOMC participants, which broadly show a significant decline over the next year. But forecasts have been predicting just such a decline for more than a year, while inflation has moved stubbornly sideways. The truth is that the path ahead for inflation remains highly uncertain. For now, let's put aside the forecasts and look instead to the macroeconomic conditions we think we need to see to bring inflation down to 2% over time. For starters, we need to raise interest rates to a level that is sufficiently restrictive to return inflation to 2%. There's considerable uncertainty about what rate will be sufficient, although there's no doubt that we've made substantial progress, raising our target range for the federal funds rate by 375 basis points since March. As our last post-meeting statement indicates, we anticipate that ongoing increases will be appropriate. It seems to me likely that the ultimate level of rates will need to be somewhat higher than thought at the time of the September meeting and the summary of economic projections. I will return to policy at the end of my comments, but for now I'll simply say that we have more ground to cover. We're tightening the stance of policy in order to slow growth in aggregate demand. Slowing demand growth should allow supply to catch up with demand and restore the balance that will yield stable prices over time. Restoring that balance is likely to require a sustained period of below-trend growth. Last year, the ongoing reopening of the economy boosted real GDP growth to a very strong 5.7%. This year, GDP was roughly flat through the first 3 quarters, and indicators point to modest growth this quarter, which seems likely to bring the year in with very modest growth overall. Several Russia's war against Ukraine and our policy actions, which tightened financial conditions and are affecting economic activity, particularly in interest-sensitive sectors such as housing. So we can say that demand growth has slowed, and we expect that this growth will need to remain at a slower pace for a sustained period. Despite the tighter policy and slower growth over the past year, we have not seen clear progress on slowing inflation. To assess what it will take to get inflation down, it's useful to break core inflation into 3 component categories: core goods inflation, housing services inflation, and inflation in core services other than housing. Core goods inflation has moved down from very high levels over the course of 2022, while housing services inflation has risen rapidly. Inflation in core services ex-housing has fluctuated, but shown no clear trend. And I'll discuss each of these items in turn. Early in the pandemic, goods prices began rising rapidly as abnormally strong demand was met by pandemic-hampered supply. Reports from businesses and many indicators suggest that supply chain issues are now easing. Both fuel and non-fuel import prices have fallen in recent months, and indicators of prices paid by manufacturers have moved down. While 12-month core goods inflation remains elevated at 4.6%, it has fallen nearly 3 percentage points from earlier this year. It is far too early to declare goods inflation vanquished, but if current trends continue, goods prices should begin to exert downward pressure on overall inflation in coming months. Housing services inflation measures the rise in the price of all rents and the rise in the rental equivalent cost of owner-occupied housing. Unlike goods inflation, housing services inflation has continued to rise and now stands at 7.1% over the past 12 months. Housing inflation tends to lag other prices around inflation turning points, however, because of the slow rate at which the stock of rental leases turns over. The market rate on new leases is a timelier indicator of where overall housing will go over the next year or so. Measures of 12-month inflation in new leases rose to nearly 20% during the pandemic, but have been falling sharply since about mid-year. As Figure 3 shows, however, overall housing services inflation has continued to rise as existing leases turn over and jump in price to catch up with the higher level of rents for new leases. And this is likely to continue well into next year. But as long as new lease inflation keeps falling, we would expect housing services inflation to begin falling sometime next year. Indeed, a decline in this kind of inflation underlies most forecasts of declining inflation. Finally, we come to core services other than housing, and this spending category covers a wide range of services, from healthcare and education to haircuts and hospitality. This is the largest of our three categories, constituting more than half the core PCE index. Thus, this may be the most important category for understanding the future evolution of core inflation. Because wages make up the largest cost in delivering these services, the labor market holds the key to understanding inflation in this category. In the labor market, demand for workers far exceeds the supply of available workers, and nominal wages have been growing at a pace well above what would be consistent with 2% inflation over time. Thus, another condition we're looking for is the restoration of balance between supply and demand in the labor market. Signs of elevated labor market tightness emerged suddenly in mid-2021. The unemployment rate at the time was much higher than the 3.5% that had prevailed without major signs of tightness before the pandemic. Employment was still millions below its level on the eve of the pandemic. Looking back, we can see that a significant and persistent labor supply shortfall opened up during the pandemic, a shortfall that appears unlikely to fully close anytime soon. Comparing the current labor force with the Congressional Budget Office's pre-pandemic forecast of labor force growth reveals a current labor force shortfall of roughly 3.5 million people. This shortfall reflects both lower than expected population growth and a lower labor force participation rate. Participation dropped sharply at the onset of the pandemic because of many factors, including sickness, caregiving, and fear of infection. Many forecasters expected that participation would move back up fairly quickly as the pandemic faded. And for workers in their prime working years, it mostly has. Overall participation, however, remains well below pre-pandemic trends. Some of the participation gap reflects workers who are still out of the labor force because they're sick with COVID-19 or continue to suffer lingering symptoms from previous COVID infections or long COVID. But recent research by Fed economists finds that the participation gap is now mostly due to excess retirements, that is, retirements in excess of what would have been expected from population aging alone. These excess retirements might now account for more than 2 million of the 3.5 million person shortfall in the labor force. What explains these excess retirements? So health issues have surely played a role, as COVID has posed a particularly large threat to the lives and health of the elderly. In addition, many older workers lost their jobs in the early stages of the pandemic when layoffs were historically high. The cost of finding new employment may have appeared particularly large for these workers, given pandemic-related disruptions to the work environment and health concerns. Also, gains in the stock market and rising house prices in the first 2 years of the pandemic contributed to an increase in wealth that likely facilitated early retirement for some people. The data so far do not suggest that excess retirements are likely to unwind because of retirees returning to the labor force. Older workers are still retiring at higher rates, and retirees do not appear to be returning to the labor force in sufficient numbers to meaningfully reduce the total number of excess retirees. So, The second factor contributing to the labor supply shortfall is slower growth in the working age population. The combination of a plunge in net immigration and a surge in deaths during the pandemic probably accounts for about 1.5 million missing workers. Policies to support labor supply are not the domain of the Fed. Our tools work principally on demand. And without advocating any particular policy, however, I will say that policy to support labor force participation could, over time, bring benefits to the workers who join the labor force and support overall economic growth. Such policies would take time to implement and have their effects. For the near term, a moderation of labor demand growth will be required to restore balance to the labor market. Currently, the unemployment rate is at 3.7%, near 50-year lows, and job openings exceed available workers by about 4 million. That is about 1.7 job openings for every person looking for work. So far, we've seen only tentative signs of a moderation in labor demand. With slower GDP growth this year, job gains have stepped down from more than 450,000 per month over the first 7 months of the year to about 290,000 per month over the past 3 months. But this job growth remains far in excess of the pace needed to accommodate population growth over time, about 100,000 per month by many estimates. Job openings have now fallen by about 1.5 million this year, but remain higher than at any time before the pandemic. Wage growth, too, shows only tentative signs of returning to balance. Some measures of wage growth have ticked down recently, but the declines are very modest so far relative to earlier increases and still leave wage growth well above levels consistent with 2% inflation over time. To be clear, strong wage growth is a good thing, but for wage growth to be sustainable, it needs to be consistent with 2% inflation. So let's then sum up this review of economic conditions that we think we need to see to bring inflation down to 2%. Growth in economic activity has slowed to well below its longer-run trend, and this needs to be sustained. Bottlenecks in goods production are easing, and goods price inflation appears to be easing as well, and this too must continue. Housing services inflation will probably keep rising well into next year, but if inflation on new leases continues to fall, we will likely see housing services inflation begin to fall later next year. Finally, the labor market, which is especially important for inflation in core services ex-housing, again accounting for more than half of the category, shows only tentative signs of rebalancing, and wage growth remains well above levels that would be consistent with 2% inflation over time. So despite some promising developments, we have a long way to go in restoring price stability. Returning to monetary policy, my FOMC colleagues and I are strongly committed to restoring price stability. After our November meeting, we noted that we anticipated that ongoing rate increases will be appropriate in order to attain a policy stance that is sufficiently restrictive to move inflation down to 2% over time. Monetary policy affects the economy and inflation with uncertain lags, and the full effects of our rapid tightening so far are yet to be felt. Thus, it makes sense to moderate the pace of our rate increases as we approach the level of restraint that will be sufficient to bring inflation down. The time for moderating the pace of rate increases may come as soon as the December meeting. Given our progress in tightening policy, the timing of that moderation is far less significant than the questions of how much further we will need to raise rates to control inflation and the length of time it will be necessary to hold policy at a restrictive level. It is likely that restoring price stability will require holding policy at a restrictive level for some time. History cautions strongly against prematurely loosening policy, and I'll close by saying that we will stay the course until the job is done. Thank you.